On this episode of Death Row Stories, a triple homicide on New Year's Eve.
She was bludgeoned to death.
And an ex-con who claims he was framed.
They wanted to get me out of the way, and they did.
When everyone in that house is murdered but you're either a suspect or you're buried somewhere.
But with an execution approaching,
I am accusing the local authorities of gross incompetence.
the state refuses to test DNA.
If you're convinced of this man's guilt, do the testing.
They weren't after the truth. They were after a conviction.
There's a body in the water.
He was butchered and murdered.
Many people proclaim their innocence.
In this case, there are a number of things that stink.
This man is remorseless.
He needs to pay for it with his life.
The electric chair flashed in front of my eyes.
Get a conviction at all costs. Let the truth fall where it may.
Pampa, Texas is a smaller type town, population around 17,000. I was elected sheriff of Gray County and took office January 1st of 1993.
Sheriff Stubblefield, after a year in office, counted down to New Year's Eve at home with his family.
I heard on the scanner, police department received a 911 call of a victim of either a shooting or a stabbing over Campbell Street. Told my wife, I said, well, I'm gonna head down there.
Happy 1994!
Police discovered 22-year-old Scooter Kaler on his neighbor's front porch with knife wounds to his torso. Kaler died shortly after reaching the hospital. Police followed a blood trail to the home where Scooter lived with his brother Randy and mother Twila.
That blood dropped and passed the blood smear on the glass of the front door.
When I walked in, the first thing I saw was a female laying on the floor there, and she's on her back. Her face was beaten off of her by an axe handle.
Notice the blood stains down the wall of the victim's pants.
I went to the back bedroom. Randolph was laying in the top bunk, a set of bunk beds on his belly. He had his little earphones in his ears and had a Walkman there beside him, and he was dead. There was 3 wounds there. One went into the heart, and that was the death blow.
For Sheriff Stubblefield, the grisly murders hit close to home.
Twila and her sons, I had known them through church. Twila's kids were special needs kids. They were God's kids. Even though they looked like grown men, mentally they were not. It was hard to take for everybody.
This is the door that leads to the outside. You believe that's blood, which leads out into the backyard.
Stubblefield knew that Twila's boyfriend, 31-year-old Hank Skinner, had moved in 3 months earlier.
When you're living in a house and everyone in that house is murdered but you're either a suspect or you're buried somewhere.
Hank Skinner had recently been released from an 8-month prison sentence for auto theft. He had 38 arrests to his name.
I knew him to be a bad person. When we found out that Skinner was not in the house, everyone received word to start driving the neighborhood, see if we'd find him out there.
Stubblefield showed up at the house of Andrea Reed, Skinner's ex-girlfriend and AA sponsor, at 3 a.m.
We told her we was looking for Skinner. Had she seen him? And her reply was, yes, he's in this house right now. And as we walked in, I could see Skinner standing in the closet that didn't have a door on it, but he kind of had the clothes pulled up around him. He had blood stains on his pants. He had a bandage on his hand. I looked down at his socks, and his socks were just soaked in blood. I said, you're being served on 2 grand jury indictments, one for aggravated assault and one for injury to a child. And his response was, is that all?
Skinner was charged with 3 counts of murder. He would face the death penalty.
The family won't ever be the same. Twila thought she was in love. And the police department, they apparently couldn't figure out a way to get him when they was told he was there. They've got him now.
Local attorney Harold Comer was appointed to defend Skinner.
People feel offended in this kind of town when something like that happens to a woman and children. We didn't have things like that. But the consequences of being convicted of a capital murder case and assess the death penalty are irreversible. You can't go back and get seconds.
Hank Skinner's trial began in Fort Worth in March of 1995.
Prosecutor in the original trial was District Attorney John Mann. John was kind of a larger-than-life figure. He wore big cowboy boots, and he had a deep, booming voice, and he was a very commanding presence in the courtroom.
The forensic evidence at the scene was very damning. There was a lot of blood. Bloody handprints in the doorways leading to Twila's son's bedroom were found to be Mr. Skinner's handprints, his fingerprints.
The front and the back of Mr. Skinner had blood that was consistent with Twila Busby's. Other blood stains were determined to be a mixture of both Twila and Elwyn's.
Skinner claimed that he'd been so high on codeine and alcohol that he passed out on the couch during the murders.
I remember waking up on the couch, somebody standing over top of me with a knife. I remember throwing my hands up. I remember running out of the house. That's all I for sure remember. Looks like I did. Everybody knows what happened except for me. If I knew what happened, I'd tell you. I don't know. I really, honestly, I don't know. Wish I did.
Hank's claimed that his codeine and vodka cocktails, he calls it, left him in a semi-coma state. I'm not buying that at all. You don't come out of a comatose state, as he said he was in, and then be able to walk, able to talk, he's able to reason, want to know why he was being arrested.
Skinner's ex-girlfriend, Andrea Reed, was the prosecution's star witness.
According to Ms. Reed, Hank Skinner showed up at her house. He wanted her to stitch up a cut in his hand and then made her swear to God that she wouldn't tell, but he thought he had kicked Twila to death.
John Mann, the prosecutor, invited the jurors to imagine driving onto a ranch and seeing puddles of water on the ground. And he said, you can infer from that it must have rained shortly before you arrived, even if you didn't see it rain. This is just like that. You shouldn't be misled by thinking this is a complicated case.
The jury came back in about 2.5 hours. Those jurors made the determination he's guilty. They also made the determination that the death penalty was, in fact, justified in this case.
But as Hank Skinner waited on death row for over 20 years, new information would come to light pointing to Hank's possible innocence and another suspect with a motive for the murders.
You know, I don't pretend like I'm some kind of a saint. I wasn't. But I spent 22.5 years down here for something I didn't do. They've killed 440-something people since I've been here. I think my girlfriend and her sons deserve to find out who did this and to get justice.
Hank Skinner sat on death row, still proclaiming his innocence. But his neighbors in Pampa, Texas, believe that justice has been done.
In Pampa, if you go to the coffee shops and you say, what do you think about Hank Skinner? Overwhelmingly, you're going to hear he should have been killed a long time ago.
Randy Stubblefield, I'd known him for years. It was like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner between me and him. He just would not leave me alone, you know. He seen an opportunity to frame Hank Skinner and he jumped right on it, you know what I'm saying?
Skinner has never taken responsibility for his own actions. I did this because so-and-so did this. He made me do it because he mistreated me. 31 years old, and at that time had been arrested 30-something times. He is a career criminal.
Hank Skinner had been on death row for 5 years when, in the year 2000, a group of student journalists began studying Hank's case. Among them was Emily Probst Miller, a student at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism.
At the end of my senior year, I was in the investigative journalism class with Professor Protess. Then the opportunity came up to go to Texas Death Row to interview Hank Skinner. What aspiring journalist wouldn't take up that opportunity?
Probst and her classmates set out to find Hank's ex-girlfriend, Andrea Reed, who had by now recanted her testimony against Hank.
Andrea Reed is an eccentric woman, so in meeting her alone, you pick up on little things that are unique to Andrea Reed. She keeps a rattlesnake in her trailer.
Your name? Andrea Reed. We have your permission to record your voice. Yes.
Andrea Reed, rightfully, is concerned. She would only be willing to talk to us in an audio file. We wouldn't be able to capture her image.
Now, you told the police and you said at trial that he got into your trailer by himself when you went back to check on your kids. Is that true?
No. The police were trying to, they were intimidating me. They were making me feel like I was helping him too much. And if I was, then I could go to jail too.
Did Hank confess to you to killing Twila and those boys?
He did not.
So he told some stories, but you didn't believe any of them were a confession to you?
No.
For Hank's trial, prosecutors had flown Andrea to Fort Worth and put her in a motel. Andrea told Emily it was like being under house arrest.
In a sworn affidavit in 1997, Andrea Reed came out and said she felt threatened by the police to give a certain story. She was worried that they could place her at the murder scene. So she was willing to play by their script. Then we went down to Texas Death Row to interview Hank Skinner. It was intimidating being, gosh, what was I? Barely legal to drink, and here I was on Texas Death Row. When he came to talk to us, one of the first things I remember was how articulate he was.
I want the world to know that I'm not a murderer. That means it's more than anything to me because I still got family that are being, they're suffering because of this. Why would I kill her? I loved her more than anything in this world. I mean, and not only that, but Scooter and Randy, why kill them? You can't find a single person that truthfully will tell you that Hank Skinner has ever laid a hand on because that ain't my bag, man. I'm not that person.
One of the things that struck me in talking to him was that there was a likely alternative suspect, Robert Donnell.
Bob Donnell was an ex-convict who had served time in jail for grand larceny. He was also Twila's uncle.
Well, his name is Robert Donnell, but everybody calls him Uncle Bob. He would come over and get Twila drunk and then try to molest her.
Skinner's attorneys had introduced Bob Donnell as an alternate suspect at the original trial. Hank claimed he'd walked in on Uncle Bob trying to rape Twila just weeks before the murders.
Bob was drunk. He's always drunk. He's a vodka drunk, and he drinks it like water. And so he's got Twila up against the wall, strangling the shit out of her in the kitchen, telling her, "I'll kill you, you sumbitch." And so me and Scooter peeled him off of her and threw him in his truck and told him, "Don't ever come back." And she was so embarrassed by it because that's her uncle, it's her blood kin. She didn't want to tell it.
Emily and her classmates looked for people who could confirm these accusations.
Were you good friends?
What? We were best friends.
Did you know her Uncle Bob?
Unfortunately.
What did Twila tell you about him?
That they were having sex. And I don't think she liked it. I think he forced himself upon her.
She told you that he forced?
Yes.
Do you think she was scared of him?
Yes, I do. I know she was.
Who do you think killed the kids?
Uncle Bob.
Why?
I believe he was jealous of Hank living in Twila's house.
The people that saw Hank Skinner that night didn't believe Hank did it. They saw the condition Hank was in, and they didn't believe that he could possibly do it.
It was New Year's Eve, and we were all having a good time together, me and Twila and her sons. Later on in the evening, we called a friend of ours, hired Mitchell, to come pick us up and take us to his New Year's Eve party.
When I got over there, Hank Skinner was passed out on the couch, and I couldn't wake him up. I jerked on his arm, everything. I couldn't get any response whatsoever. In other words, he was out cold, you know.
While Hank Skinner was asleep on the couch, Twila went to the New Year's Eve party. Uncle Bob was there.
She got over there and everybody's, where's Hank at? And she says, oh, he's over at the house sick, passed out. We can't wake him up. So Bob knows he's got a chance.
Howard Mitchell's daughter Sarah was at the party with Twila and Uncle Bob.
Did you notice anything unusual with Twila that night?
Yeah, it was her uncle. He was following her around. He was hitting on her. He was doing all these things that he wasn't supposed to do. Trying to kiss her and talk to her ear and all that nasty stuff. This was her uncle. This was not supposed to be happening, okay? And he would follow her constantly.
Twila and Robert Donnell in the same place shortly before the murders. He was stalking her. This needed further investigation.
Now focused on Robert Donnell, Emily and her fellow students were about to learn about physical evidence that could place Bob at the scene of the murders. While Hank Skinner sat on death row for the murders of Twila Busby and her sons, Emily Probst Miller and her fellow journalism students pored over crime scene photos and evidence reports. They soon discovered a key piece of evidence, a bloody windbreaker found next to Twila's body.
The jacket was a man's extra large, 44, 46. It's too big for me. And a criminalist who examined the evidence said that that jacket was worn by the assailant because it has medium velocity blood impact spatter all over the cuffs and the forearms and the sleeves.
Suspecting the windbreaker belonged to Bob Donnell, the students spoke with Deborah Ellis, a neighbor who cared for Bob's wife.
This is a picture of a jacket that was found at the crime scene.
I'm 100% sure this is Robert Donnell's jacket. He wore it all the time. I never saw Robert wear the jacket after the murders, ever.
Ellis also saw Bob cleaning his truck just after the murders.
He took the rubber and everything out of the floorboard and then he put new carpet in it.
It turned out that Donnell's own wife had been suspicious about his involvement in the murders.
She was questioning him about what had happened to Twila and her boys. And she told me that he had told her that if she didn't shut up and quit talking to him about it and quit asking him about it, that she would end up the same way that they did. He would do the same to her that he did to them. Meaning, referencing to Twila and her boys, he would kill her like he killed them.
3 years after the murders, Bob Donnell was driving drunk when he crashed into a tractor trailer. He was killed instantly.
Twila's uncle, he was never a suspect on it. But it's awful easy to point your finger to a man who can't defend himself because he's no longer living.
Hank Skinner had been on death row for almost a decade when attorney Robert Owen joined his appeals team. Owen, who co-directed the Capital Punishment Clinic at the University of Texas, was surprised to learn that the windbreaker had never been submitted for DNA testing.
There were human hairs on this jacket, there were sweat stains on this jacket, there were blood stains on this jacket. It was a veritable cornucopia of possible DNA testing.
Owen believed he had strong grounds for appeal because the state had failed to test the windbreaker and other key evidence.
In the living room, there is a black plastic garbage bag, and inside that garbage bag, there were found a knife and a hand towel, and they didn't test either of those items. There's a second knife which was found on the porch of the house, and which I think now we would say is very likely the murder weapon for Mr. Busby and Mr. Kaler. They didn't do any DNA testing on that either. The testing that they did seemed designed to confirm their case against Mr. Skinner rather than to explore the possibility that someone else's DNA was present at the scene.
In 2001, Skinner's attorneys filed a request with the state to run DNA tests on the evidence. District Attorney John Mann refused.
This case doesn't turn on DNA. There was just an overwhelming amount of evidence. I could have salted him away without any DNA evidence at the trial.
John Mann had made his decision that night when he went to the murder scene. And he had already made statements to the media that I'm the one who done it. They're not going to stop and say, oops, we made a mistake. It's not Hank, it's this dude over here. They wanted to get me out of the way, and they did.
Mann argued that Skinner's original defense attorney had known about the DNA evidence, but made a decision to not have it tested.
The state said, well, DNA existed at the time of Mr. Skinner's trial, so you lose, Mr. Skinner, because it's your fault for not having sought the testing when you could have done it.
To counter the state of Texas stonewalling, Emily's journalism professor, David Protess, decided to take Skinner's case to the press.
Lo and behold, every media outlet wanted their hands on it. Nancy Grace invited John Mann, the district attorney, and Professor Protess and myself on for an interview.
Welcome to Pros and Cons. David Protess, professor. I know blood spatter evidence. How could this guy have gotten blood spatters on his shirt if he wasn't there when the crime was committed?
He doesn't deny being there when the crime was committed. He was unconscious, he says, and toxicology reports support this, but my students conducted a series of interviews with people who suggest very strongly that Twila Busby's uncle could well be the killer in this case. Now,
we had a chance. We had all this information. He was completely checked out. You're talking about Skinner and a bunch of other dopers. That's what you've got in a den over there. Skinner did it, and he got the death penalty.
Mr. Mann, I'm sorry. A bloodied set of fingerprints were found on a bag containing the knife. Will you join me in requesting that the courts conduct DNA tests on the physical evidence that is outstanding in this case before a possibly innocent man is put to death?
Well, gentlemen and Emily, I'm going to have to let you go.
1 month after the Nancy Grace show, John Mann changed his mind about the DNA.
John Mann decided on his own to do some DNA testing, but he did it without the involvement of the defense. He boxed up some items and sent them off for testing and told the lab what to test.
The first items Mann sent for testing included a set of human hairs found in Twila's hands.
And the mitochondrial DNA on those hairs comes back to Twila Busby's mitochondrial line.
This meant the hairs belonged to someone on Twila's mother's side of the family.
Visually, these hairs didn't look like the hairs from either Twila or her sons. And a reasonable juror could say those hairs could belong to Robert Donnell.
With hair, you have a lot of different colors on your head, even though it looks at a distance like it's all one color. So although those 3 hairs that tested to her maternal lineage looked like they were a different color, that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't her hair or one of her son's hairs.
Sure. Well, that's what I would say too if I were in their position and I was trying to explain away why their expert said that these hairs didn't look like Twila's and didn't look like Elwyn Kaler's and didn't look like Randy Busby's.
The hair in Twila's hand could not conclusively be determined to belong to Bob Donnell, and John Mann shut down any further DNA testing.
Skinner thinks the longer time that he has on appeal after appeal after appeal, the greater probability that Texas will do away with the death sentence and he will be commuted to life. And I think that's all he's after.
I don't have to prove who did do it. That's the police's job. All I got to prove is I didn't do it. And we have that evidence now.
In 1996, French anti-death penalty activist Sandrine Augeorges began writing letters to several inmates in Huntsville, Texas. One of them was Hank Skinner.
Hank is a very sociable person. He has a great sense of humor, sometimes cynical, but I like that, so that's okay. We started writing and he told me about his case. And honestly, I thought, this is nuts. If you're convinced of this man's guilt, do the testing.
Sandrine, you weren't there. How can you be so convinced he didn't do it?
It is just mind-boggling that evidence preserved from the crime scene, including a male jacket, a rape kit, and the murder weapons, to this day is not tested.
Curious why Hank's attorney Harold Comer hadn't tested key evidence, Sandrine traveled to Pampa.
Comer was a former prosecutor who also had prosecuted Hank twice. There were leads in testing that he should have pursued. There's a bloody handprint on the trash bag where the knife was found with the kitchen towel. It's not Hank's print. Whose is it?
Comer insists that not testing every item for DNA was a strategic decision.
We argued that you can't send a man to his death as long as there's evidence laying off in some evidence room that has not been tested. I think if we'd insisted on testing before trial, he would have not had the avenue of appeal that he has now, and it could well he would have been executed by now.
We felt that was not a reasonable strategy under the circumstances of the case, given that you had a client who was insisting on his innocence.
In 2005, Owen filed an appeal arguing that Comer provided ineffective counsel in not testing DNA and failing to introduce Hank's codeine allergy, which could have explained how he'd slept through the murders.
The toxicology report said codeine and vodka.
Skinner's blood codeine level was 0.44. A toxicologist testified that was so high, Skinner would have been in a coma-like state.
And then the question is, if he were allergic to codeine, why would he take codeine?
To counter Hank's allergy claim, the state called Dr. Michael Chamalis, who had treated Hank for broken ribs 2 months before the murders.
It takes a tremendous amount of trauma to break 4 ribs. There was no doubt he had broken ribs, but I did not think that that was recent because of the findings externally. Drug seekers will say I'm allergic to codeine because it's not strong enough. So I was very dubious about giving him narcotics. I told the nurse, I said, I want you to keep the door open and watch him. And then she told me that she had seen him taking syringes out and putting them in his pocket. Mr. Skinner was a very smart man. He did not want to go out in the street and buy drugs.
The fact that a previous emergency room physician who had treated him believed him to be a drug seeker indicates that he wasn't actually allergic to codeine and probably could have developed quite a tolerance to it.
On the night of the crime, he had a ton of codeine in his system. The only way that doesn't affect you is if you are a regular user of codeine. And Dr. Chamalis himself says Hank didn't want codeine.
We had been partying all afternoon. I accidentally ingested some codeine pills out of Twila's drink, and I got sick. I had no idea what was going on. When you're suffering this codeine reaction, your vision's out. It's going like this and like this and this and this way and this way and that way. I'm messed up to the point that I can't operate. I can't talk. I can't walk. I'm just incoherent and incapacitated. When I woke up, everybody in the house was dead or dying.
The U.S. District Court in Amarillo agreed with Owen that Skinner's previous counsel should have introduced his codeine allergy, but they ruled that this information would not have swayed the jury. They also ruled that Comer's decision not to test the DNA was an intentional legal strategy and not grounds for a retrial.
The state's approach is to say, well, any individual item of evidence that we've come up with to call into question their theory, standing alone, wouldn't have changed the outcome of the case. But when you think of it as a wall, and suddenly it has a lot of little holes in it, a reasonable juror might say, this just is too much doubt for me.
Despite crucial DNA evidence yet to be tested, the court set an execution date, February 24th, 2010.
This is just so damn insane. It's like a bad rerun of The Twilight Zone. My lawyer came up here to see me and he told me, he said, man, I'm scared. He said, I'm gonna be honest with you, we're in trouble.
By 2010, Hank Skinner had been on death row for 15 years. He had lost every appeal, and his execution date was weeks away. Skinner had few legal options left. His last best hope was a request for DNA analysis on bloodstains and the windbreaker found at the crime scene. On March 24, 2010, Skinner was transported to the Huntsville Execution Unit, the busiest death chamber in the country. Hank's execution was scheduled for 6 p.m.
We were trying on all fronts to stop the execution without success. The clock was ticking down.
My lawyer tells me, he says, this claim that you filed, he said, I just want to tell you, to be honest with you, man. He said, they haven't denied it yet, but I'm sure they're going to. He said, you need to prepare yourself because this is it.
Emily Probst Miller, now a producer at CNN, was following the case from the newsroom in Atlanta.
I stood up 5 months pregnant and said, there's a man that's scheduled to die in Texas today, and he's asking for DNA to be tested. This case should not go unnoticed.
For Sandrine and Georges, who had championed Hank's case for more than a decade, the execution had become even more personal.
I had to tell my friends, I said, guys, there's something you don't know about my life, but I'm married and my husband is on death row in Texas.
After 12 years of writing letters and talking through protective glass, Sandrine and Hank were married in 2008. Sandrine and the rest of Hank's family were given a final visit.
Hank's daughters wanted to come down and see him. His eldest daughter did not remember him, although he was with her when she was 4. His second daughter, she had never lived with her dad, so they were basically meeting their dad for the first time.
I'm talking to my daughters on the phone, they're just delirious crying. And so I tried to be strong for my kids and my wife and my family, man, and tell them don't worry about it. You know, after it's over with, go over there and get you a few tequila shots, get your ass on that airplane and forget it ever happened. Remember me as I was in life, laughing, joking, and talking. And so they told me, you got to get off the phone.
The way they, I would say, kick you out of the unit is really unpleasant. I have, over the years, seen many, many families in the visitation room saying goodbye on execution day. You say goodbye over the phone through the glass. I don't really know how to describe that because it's sorry.
Sheriff Randy Stubblefield drove 500 miles to watch Hank die.
I had told Twila's mother that I would be there at that time. I am pro-death penalty. Hank's had too many opportunities in and out of the prison system. Again, in my opinion, the Bible says eye for an eye, and that's what I believe.
At 4 p.m., Hank was given his final meal and received last rites from a priest.
It's worse than having someone have a gun in your face because of the way they kill you, man. They're gonna strap you down to a table, you're perfectly healthy, you'd live otherwise, and they're gonna inject you full of gunk and kill you. I mean, it's like putting a dog to sleep. I was thinking about all the guys that I knew who had come over here and who'd suffered this same thing. That gurney is like a horizontal cross. You're being crucified laying down.
We were all sitting around fixing to be moved into the observation room. He had family that was there. They were bringing him down the hall and into the death chamber, getting him ready to be strapped in.
Chaplain hands me the phone, and my lawyer, he said, when he did that, I knew the next words out of his mouth was going to be, I'm sorry, Hank. And I'm just thinking, oh, it's over with. He says, well, the Supreme Court granted you a stay.
Wow, I can tell you at that point, your body just gives up because you've been holding on for so long. That pressure just goes off your shoulders, but suddenly your legs don't carry you.
I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't talk. I felt out of place. I felt like I wasn't supposed to be here. I had a lot of stuff going on in my mind, man. It was like any minute I thought they were gonna come knock on my cell door and say, oops, we made a mistake. Come on, we gotta take you back over there. You know what I'm saying?
So we left. There was a lot of protesters outside. His wife, who he married since he's been on death row, was there with her group. We didn't speak to anyone. We just went and got in our cars and we left.
This is a case where it might be easier than many other cases to lose hope. We have had success at moments in the case. But by prevailing in the Supreme Court, all we got was to go back to federal district court and start over with our lawsuit.
A year after the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling, the Texas legislature changed state laws regarding DNA analysis. Finally, Rob Owen would get to test key evidence from the crime scene.
The jacket that was found next to Twila Busby's body is probably the most important piece of evidence in the case. It could confirm our theory that Robert Donnell was the person responsible for Twila Busby's murder. The state contacted us and said, well, basically we give up, we'll do the testing. But there's one thing, we don't have the jacket. The jacket had been lost.
In 2012, state prosecutors finally agreed to run DNA testing on all the crime scene evidence from the murder of Twila Busby and her sons. Hank Skinner believed that a bloody windbreaker found at the scene was the key to proving his innocence. But the state said they had lost it.
We were battling the state of Texas for 13 years to get this evidence tested. The one thing that by itself would have definitely exonerated me, the state has mysteriously lost it.
It's unfortunate that sometimes a piece of evidence is mislaid in an evidence room, in a locker, or it gets lost during transport to the court, but it's a human system, and you have to expect that sometimes mistakes will happen.
There is no reason why an object as large as a man's windbreaker jacket should just disappear. And even in this case, the state managed to maintain the custody of items as small as fingernail clippings, and yet somehow they lost this jacket, they say. In 2005, John Mann testified, and I had the opportunity to ask him straightforwardly whether he thought that the law enforcement apparatus in Pampa was equipped to handle an investigation of a case as serious as this one. And to his great credit, he very candidly said no. You really get it there from the horse's mouth. I don't really think this law enforcement agency is capable of doing this. That ought to give people serious pause about pursuing this judgment.
Evidentiary hearing into the conviction of death row inmate Hank Skinner gets underway today. Attorneys presented findings from 3 separate post-conviction DNA tests. But the one piece of evidence that could not be tested, that's this jacket, was lost by the state. Since it was not tested and cannot be located, it cannot be a part of this hearing.
Despite the missing windbreaker, the state claimed test results from other evidence only cemented Hank's guilt.
That testing revealed the blood that was spattered on Hank was spattered on pretty much every facet, front and back, sides, the cuffs of the shirt, the insides of the legs, the front and the back. And that just isn't possible unless his body was moving in space while the blood was spattering against it.
We know that he has a hand injury that suggests he grappled with the assailant. That could have resulted in there being some blood on the back of his clothing.
Testing also revealed that the bloody palm prints found on the wall matched Hank's DNA.
The cut was on his palm, and if your hand is slick with your victim's blood all over the handle, your hand is going to slide down onto the blade of the knife.
The person who stabbed Elwyn Kaler almost certainly had Kaler's blood on his own hands. If that assailant had been Mr. Skinner, whose own right hand is bleeding by the time he leaves the house, there should be mixtures of Mr. Kaler's blood and Mr. Skinner's blood, but we don't find that. There's only Mr. Skinner's blood.
But a bloody towel found in the trash bag with one of the knives contained DNA from an unidentified person.
The towel shows Twila's blood and somebody else's DNA. Someone was in the room who is not Mr. Skinner or the other victims. There's also some foreign DNA on one side of this towel that we do know who it belongs to. One of the state's DNA experts and the court reporter from the trial, his DNA is present on at least 2 items. One of those was the knife. It is really troubling that after a decade or more of struggling to get this DNA testing, the state couldn't complete the testing without contaminating some of the evidence.
The 31st District Judge ruled that the new evidence was inconclusive and would not have affected the jury's decision. After more than 2 decades and millions of dollars in legal fees, Hank Skinner sits on death row, still proclaiming his innocence. Today, Hank's last hope is reanalysis of the DNA evidence. If that fails to reveal any new information, a new execution date will be set.
Our duty as a defense counsel, even if we believe a person is guilty, is to make the state prove the guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, particularly in a capital murder case. It's worth the time, I think, and it's worth the money. The alternative is unthinkable.
When I add together the very best possible arguments that Mr. Skinner's supporters make, such as the court reporter's DNA being found on the knife handle, such as the missing gray windbreaker, it still seems to me like if you wake up and find your girlfriend dead on the floor in front of you and her child is dead in his bed, you wouldn't immediately go to your Narcotics Anonymous sponsor's house. You'd call the police.
I don't know what happened that night. And it haunts me to this day. When we still don't have the truth, 20 some odd years later, this is the system run amok.
I'm not accusing the local authorities of conspiring to frame a man that they believe or know is innocent. I am accusing them of gross incompetence, and I think that's borne out by the evidence. Should an entity that can't administer the system any more competently than that be allowed to kill people?
If he gets another execution date, I'll be there. The Skinner case has been the biggest case I ever worked on, and the death sentence was imposed on this case. To me, when that's done and over with, it's going to put a closure onto a part of my life that I've had for 22 years sitting here.
Closure's like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. That's such a fallacy. Closure is up to you. It's not up to killing somebody that's going to grant it to you. And I can't tell you how many people have come out of that death house over there and now they're doubly traumatized because they've lost their loved one, then they've stood there and watched somebody else die. And so they're not getting any solace out of it at all. There's no such thing as closure.
Well, I got to hang up.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me ask you a question. Do you think I did this?